Today we're going to be talking about Kant's transcendental idealism. Kant offers a new way of synthesizing the insights behind rationalism and the insights behind empiricism. It's officially a version of rationalism, but as we'll see, it has a lot in common with Hume's empiricism, for example. In fact, Kant says, for a long time, I was a rationalist in the tradition of Descartes and Leibniz. And it was really reading Hume that awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers and made me realize there were problems with that position. So what he gives us is something like a synthesis of Leibniz and Hume. It's a way of combining that empiricist tradition as it finds expression in Hume with the rationalist tradition as it finds expression in Leibniz and coming up with something dramatically new. Kant's transcendental idealism is something that is found in one of his great three critiques, this one, the Critique of Pure Reason. And it is a long work, it is an extremely elaborate work, it's complicated, but I think I can express the general view in just one class period. It might be that going through the argument for it is a much more complicated thing. I've taught entire semester courses on that particular work. But today we're just going to look at the highlights. We've looked before at Kant, we've looked at his ethical works, for example, and tried to understand his approach to ethics. Recall that that was an approach that was based on the idea that we're searching for fundamental moral truths that are universal and that are necessary. And so, thinking back to Leibniz and his test for things that are a priori, Kant says those are things that are a priori. And he's similarly going to find throughout all spheres, not just in ethics, something that is really a synthetic a priori foundation. So he compares his own work to that of Copernicus. Copernicus, remember, was born into a world that had thought for thousands of years that the Earth was the center of the universe, and the sun and the other planets revolved around the Earth. Copernicus said, wait a minute, I can do a much better job of explaining the motions of the planets and the stars if I assume instead that the sun is the center of the solar system and the Earth revolves around it. And Kant sees himself as doing something similar. He says, really, we've been assuming that there's one sort of thing here that's central and everything else has to revolve around it. I'm going to switch it around so that this other thing is central and the other things have to revolve around it. Now, as we'll see, I actually think what he's doing is more like the reverse of Copernicus. I think he's more giving us a Ptolemaic revolution, but that's not how, that would be bad marketing to say, you know, that great achievement in astronomy and philosophy, I'm going to go in exactly the opposite direction. But he is doing a similar kind of thing of switching perspectives around. So, what is he doing? Well, you might look at it this way. The rationalists have been arguing that universality and necessity require synthetic a priori knowledge. There must be something that is in our heads from the beginning that allows us to take contingent and particular experience and get out of it a knowledge of universal and necessary truths. Things like the truths of mathematics or scientific laws, for example. And so the idea must be that there has to be something in experience that actually allows us to do this. It's not found in experience itself, but rather in our processing of experience. There has to be something that is part of our cognitive structure, that is a priori, that is inborn, and thereby allows us to transform this contingent and particular experience in such a way that we get out of it something universal and necessary. Hume says, well, look, if we think about necessity, we realize that the source isn't in the world. We can't find it in the world. I'd like to say certain things follow necessarily from other things, or that some things cause other things, but actually I can never find the necessary connection. I can never find the causal link. All I see is one thing following another. And so Hume concludes the source is not in the world, but the source of these ideas is in us. The source of necessity, the source of causation, all of these things are in us. And so he refers to them as something that is a product of custom, of habit, of whatever it is within us. And ultimately, the impression he finds as the source is this feeling of expectation that if the one thing happens, then the other is going to happen as well. Kant says, well, in a way, Hume, yes, you're right. You did awake me from my dogmatic slumbers. I was assuming too easily that we had some basis for these connections. In fact, it's not that easy. You're right, the source is within us. But, Kant says, it's not custom, it's not habit, it's not some sort of feeling or emotion. It's instead something in reason. Reason is what tells us to look for causal relationships. Reason is what tells us it's not just, one more case of 1 plus 1 being 2, what are you going to do? It's rather that 1 plus 1 has to be 2. There is a necessity to this, And yes, it's being supplied by us, but by reason. The rational part of us, it's not being supplied by feeling. 1 plus 1, I just got this feeling, it's going to be 2. No, arithmetic doesn't depend on feelings in that way. It doesn't depend on habits. It's like, yeah, I just got into the habit in grade school of adding 1 and 1 got 2, and what are you going to do? You just get used to it. That's not what's going on. It's a rational thing. 1 plus 1 is 2 for reasons that have to do with rationality. Reason, not just emotion or custom or habit or something like that. So, here's a little picture of the world according to the Ptolemaic view. And here is a picture of the Copernican hypothesis with the sun rather than the earth at the center. This is what Kant is going to bring about here. And he asks us a dramatic sort of question, a startling question. He says, do our concepts revolve around objects? As realists think, the world is what it is, right? And our job is to get it right. Iris Murdoch at one point says, one ought to be taught in schools to attend and get things right. The world is the way it is, and our minds have the job of trying to adapt themselves to the world and trying to match the world, represent it accurately. But Kant says, well, that's one way of thinking about it. But what about this thought experiment? What if the objects have to revolve around our concepts? That is to say, what if the way we conceptualize the world actually processes experience in a certain way, that the objects of experience have to conform to our concepts? So you can say, gosh, how is it that the world just seems to consist of these objects, standing in relations, having properties, and so forth? The realist, like Aristotle, says, well, that's the way the world is. But Kant says, what if our brains are such that they just organize things in that way? Our brains organize things into, well, objects. We carve the world into objects. Think about that Buddhist picture of the world being something like a big bowl of oatmeal, or a pizza that has not yet been carved. And our brains are carving it up. What if the way we do it is so built in, is really innate in us, in such a way that it's not like the pizza where we can carve it in all sorts of ways, but instead our brains automatically do this. But we're the ones doing the carving. To that extent, the Buddhist picture is right, or Hume's picture is right. It's just that, for the most part, we don't have a choice about how we do it. Our brains do it before we're even really aware of it. That's Kant's picture. The objects actually do revolve around our concepts, because our brains are the ones that are actually forming this mass of experience into objects. Yeah?
So he's basically saying that our mind is the thing that controls our perceptions. We kind of make things more from how we believe it to be.
That's right. Our mind is really controlling the perceptions. It's taking something, and really it's sort of something I know that was, we'll see. There's something that our brains are doing in reaction to things that produces some of these mental representations that we have. We organize what he calls the synthesize what he calls the manifold of intuition into these thoughts of objects and perceptions of objects. But one way of looking at it is think right now, I'm looking at this very complicated thing, right? This room full of people. And actually, if you analyze what's coming into my eye and appearing there on the retina, it's this extremely complex pattern of things. And so there's an activation pattern on the retina. Well, some little part of that gets transmitted to the brain. Actually, most of the information on retinas gets discarded, because only some of it can fit through the optic nerve. We could process all that information, but our brains would have to be the size of dump trucks to actually do it. So we discard most of that information, but then our brains organize that. And now I see individual chairs, I see individual people. But if you would first think about what's there in the retina, it's just this complicated pattern of dots with rods and cones responding in certain ways that is producing these electrical signals to the brain. And so in a way what Kant is saying is, look, it's my brain that is carving up this into the things I perceive. Now I'm not doing it consciously. I'm not thinking, gosh, here are two people. Where does one end and the other begin? I think I'll say there, that's happening automatically. I just see two people here. I don't immediately think, oh, here's some person mush. I have to carve it up into individual being. So all this is happening at a sort of subconscious level, but he says it's happening a priori. It's something that is built into my cognitive structure from birth. It's not something that I choose or learn to do.
Is he extreme as he is in a way that our perception of this is something and not is going? Because if it is that powerful, maybe we can do something like chasing the dogs and children.
Yeah. All right, good. Yeah, it's very easy to, I think, given what we've said now, draw a distinction between Hume's vision of objects and Kant's vision of objects. For Hume, there really is just this mass of stuff, and I am carving out into objects for various purposes. As with passenger, right? Airlines talk about the number of passengers they fly. That's useful for them. They don't really care how often that individual person is flying, except insofar as they have frequent flyer programs and so on. But ordinarily, the point is, we need to know how many people we're going to have to transport around. And so we care how many passengers we have. We don't really care how many people are flying. But that's the sort of picture Hume and Buddhism gives you, where our conscious activity is involved in this. And I think Kant's picture is different. I don't look out here and think, how many people should I carve this experience up into? That's something that happens automatically, right? And it has to do with the persistence of these objects too. I don't look here and see someone, and then look away and look back and see that person, and then think, they're kind of similar people. I think I'll call that one person, but they're really two objects. No, innately, it's not a conscious choice. My brain processes that as the same person. And so I look, there she is. I look away, I look back. There the same person is. And my brain's already organized in that way. So in that sense, the objects are not just grouped together sort of automatically by the structure of my mind a priori. I identify those objects as persisting a priori. I'm just set up to do that. You could be a Humean who looks around and says, wow, I'm in a new room, but it's really similar to the other. Oh, she just moved her hand, so now it's a new room, but it's really similar to the other, and so it's not like that. My brain immediately processes it as the same room. And I look at people and I see them as the same people. And so all that kind of continuity that Hume says is a matter of custom or habit, when it's not a conscious decision, is really for Kant different from that. It's something that's happening a priori. My ability to do that and my tendency to do that is just innate. I can't stop it. I really can't, in that sense, think of myself as a Humean or a Buddhist who says, gosh, it is just a different person every time. But I guess it's convenient to think of that as the same human being. No, it's not like that. My brain has to think of it that way. And it's only as a sort of parlor trick, maybe, that I can imagine thinking of it in another way. Yeah?
What about the thought that experience changes someone? Would that necessarily mean that you're a different person? Even if, like, yesterday we saw them at the opiate test, and after you saw them, they were a traumatic event, and they're completely different.
Okay, good. There are changes in objects. And now, when do we decide that it's really a different object? For example, a different person. Let's say someone undergoes a traumatic experience. At one point, Picasso actually said, I saw my friends off to World War I, and I never saw them again. And it's not that literally he didn't see them again. They did come back. Those friends he was talking about survived the war. But he said, I never saw them again because they were so dramatically changed. By the time they got back from World War I, different person. Or my daughter was in a relationship with somebody for a very long time. And then that person had brain surgery. And afterwards, their personality was really different. And so you could say, wow, okay, that really did feel like a new person. And a different person, because the way that person behaved, their own tendencies, dispositions, personality traits seemed really different. And so that kind of thing can occur. And sometimes we do have that problem. Like, is this the same thing? It's changed so much, I'm not sure. Let's go back to my example of the ship of Theseus. We start replacing things on the ship. At some point, you might say, wow, that's a different ship. Right? Or somebody starts building onto their house. At what point does it become a different house? It might be that if we change it dramatically enough, we say it's a different thing. Otherwise, we might say, oh, well, you did a renovation on your house. We assume it's the same house. But admittedly, at some point, if I say, yeah, I did a renovation, I bulldozed the thing, got all that out there, and then rebuilt, we'd say, oh, it's a different house on the same foundation. And so I think it's not as if Kant is saying our brains are fixed in such a way that I can't recognize that sometimes change really does change the identity of the person or the object. It's just that I start out seeing similar things over time, and I assume it's the same object. That's sort of the built-in assumption. And then it requires a lot of change, actually, for me to be convinced it's a different thing. right? Try to imagine what it would take for you to say, wow, that's not Bonneback up there, it's a different person. Now here's an easy one. I walk out and then somebody who doesn't look at all like me comes in and starts talking, right? Then you definitely say it's a different person. But what if it happens gradually? What if you, I don't know, sped up my life in such a way that actually this is a compendium of all the classes I've ever taught? Just fucking very quickly, yeah. You might say, whoa, there he is as a young guy, and there he is. Wow. Presumably, you still see me as the same person, even though you compress like 40 years of changes into a small space. What happens then in other cases? It gets hard to say. Is the acorn the same as the oak tree that grows from it? Does that change at some point and become a different thing? So I think Kant is not denying that there will be vague cases and cases where change can be so great that we start thinking of this as a different person or a different thing. But our tendency to think of things as persisting across time is something that is built into us. So here's how he articulates this. He says, it's hitherto been assumed that our knowledge must conform to the objects, but all attempts to ascertain anything about these objects a priori by means of concepts, and thus to extend the range of our knowledge, have been rendered abortive by this assumption. So he's really saying, look, if you assume that the objects are out there independently of the mind, and then we are having the job of trying to represent those accurately, the only way we have of representing them is experience. And so there's no way to know anything a priori. Now we've seen that in the classical rationalist tradition, there's something like the following assumption. God stamps the world and stamps our mind with the same stamp. And a good God will want those to match so that we actually have the ability to know the world. And by reflecting on the structure of our own minds, therefore, we could know something a priori. I think Kant is saying, look, that was killed once and for all by Descartes' evil demon experiment. That won't work, and Hume clearly sees that won't work. There is no way to actually assume such a match. That match would have to be argued for. But how could you possibly argue for it except through experience? And so in the end, he thinks that's a failure. But you might think then he lands in empiricism, happily a companion of Hume. But he says, well, no, let's try another experiment. Let's assume that the objects must conform to our knowledge. If the object has to conform to my own perceptual and cognitive faculties, has to conform to my own mind, then the structure of my mind will match the structure of the objects, because the objects have to match the structure of my mind. That's the only way they can become objects for me. So he says it's the same thing with intuition, by which he means perception. If perceptions have to conform to the nature of the objects, I don't see how we can know anything of them a priori. But if, on the other hand, the object conforms to the nature of our faculty of intuition or perception, I can then easily conceive the possibility of such a priori knowledge. So here's a way of thinking about it. We've got a screen here, right? Imagine that this is like the mind, and that way this is the mind. Now, if I say, aha, something is going to be on the next slide, I'm not going to tell you anything about it, you won't have experienced it yet, but then I'll say something about what that slide is going to be. Can you tell me anything? Now, you might guess it's similar to this slide. It'll have words and a white background and stuff. But that's based on experience. Is there anything you could know without knowing what slides I've shown in this class before? Let's say somebody walks through the door for the first time. They haven't been in here before. Will they know anything about what might be projected up on that screen? A priori. Just by knowing about the projector. Yeah?
It'll probably be a square.
Good, it'll be something rectangular, right? Yeah, so that's something you can know just by knowing the nature of the screen and the projector. Anything else you might know about? Yeah?
It contains words.
Good, it will contain words or something else that communicates, right? Some image, some word, something that will communicate something. After all, why on earth else is it there? What else could you assume about? Yeah?
That's a very tall bit about the little iPad thing.
True, I'm doing this with an iPad, and so if you know just something about the structure of the iPad, you'll know at the top it'll say iPad, give you the time, and then tell you how much battery power is left. So you could know that just by knowing about the iPad, right? Without at all knowing anything about the file I'm about to open. Yeah?
It'll contain information relevant to the previous slide.
Ooh, good! It'll contain some information that in some way connects to what was on the previous slide. Yeah, and Kant says that's true of experience too. The next experience you have is going to connect in some way to the experience you're having now. And how do I know that? Just because that's the way the mind is structured. It's going to take whatever happens next as related to what's happening now. And so that we see the world as consisting of things that are connected causally and so on, that's just part of what the mind does. It organizes things in that sort of fashion. We perceive things in time. We perceive things that are close together as connected. If they're very similar, we perceive them as the same object. All that is something we can know a priori by just knowing something about the nature of the mind. Just as we can know all that stuff about the slides on the basis of something before we've even seen the content of the slide. And so it's something like that. Look, if you know enough about the projector, you can say certain things before you've even seen what it projects. And similarly, if we know enough about our own minds, then we can actually know something about the nature of what's going to be experienced by that mind and what can be known by that mind without even yet having the experience. So he says, we're going to do just what Copernicus did. When he found he could make no progress by assuming all the heavenly bodies revolved around the spectator, he decided, what if we tried having the spectator revolve while the stars remain at rest? Well, he says, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to presuppose in myself laws of the understanding, which are expressed in concepts a priori. All the objects of experience must necessarily conform to these concepts. So, the idea is going to be there are certain built-in concepts, certain built-in laws, so both concepts and principles must be in the mind a priori in order for me to actually know things with universality, with necessity, to know anything about causation or other connections. He's giving us here what I've called, in talking about Descartes, a transcendental argument. And Kant is really the first person to identify this as a unique kind of argument and to give it that name. What is a transcendental argument? It's an argument from the possibility of something, identifying necessary conditions for the possibility of something. And so in this case, he's saying, look, Q is a necessary condition for the possibility of P. P would be impossible if it weren't the case that Q. But P is true, right? It's not impossible, it happens. So Q must be the case. And that's the general form of argument that we've identified as a transcendental argument. Remember, in Descartes, it had to do with clear and distinct perceptions, and those being things that were trustworthy. Well, here it means something different. And don't worry if you don't have that slide down. I've just put in something for the P and the Q here. It's otherwise the same. His is this. A priori concepts and laws of the understanding are necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. Experience of objects as we perceive them. And we do have experience. Therefore, there are a priori concepts and laws of the understanding. Essentially, he's saying, well, if we didn't have these a priori laws, if we didn't have these a priori concepts, then actually the way the Buddhist describes the world, the way Hume describes the world, would be accurate. The world would be like this bowl of oatmeal, and our minds would be, as it were, dipping spoons into the bowl of oatmeal and carving it up into objects. And so we'd walk into the room anew every time and say, whoa, totally different room, totally different people. I guess it's my job now to figure out how many people there are and where that person ends and this one begins, and to figure out whether any of those are people I should be identifying with previous people. But Kant says that's not what our experience is like at all. I experience the same room, the same people. Over time, I perceive things as being causally connected. That there must be a priori concepts and laws that permit me to do that. But there's an important consequence of this. Here's the good news. We have a priori knowledge. We do have a priori concepts. We have a priori laws of the understanding that will tell us things like, yes, the world is carved up into objects. These objects persist over time. Yes, we link events together through causation, and that's legitimate given the nature of the objects. But here's the bad news. We can only talk about the objects insofar as our minds process them. And so you might think, look, I know what's being projected up there, a priori, something about it anyway, a priori, before I even see the slide, because I know it's being projected by an iPad and that kind of projector, and if I know the source, I can know something about the general nature of what must be projected, even if I haven't experienced it yet. But can I know anything about what is actually underlying it, what's causing them to project it? What the input is that actually leads to that? Well, no. Okay. Do I know anything about the structure of what is entering that projector in order for it to project this? right? If I just look at this and what the projector produces, I can learn about the projector to some extent, but what is the form of the signal that leads us to do this? I don't know. And so he says, I can know things, and I can know things a priori, there's the good news, but I can know only what my mind is contributing to them, and that's the bad news, okay? The laws that govern the entire realm of experience, these laws are in us, and we can know those independently of experience, and so we can know those before we've even faced anything that would actually trigger those things in us. But here's the problem. We can know things only as they're processed by our own perceptual and cognitive faculties, only as we perceive them. We can't know the things in themselves. So Kant draws a distinction between the appearances. Those are things we can know, and in fact we can have a priori knowledge of those. Some a priori knowledge. But on the other hand, the things as they are in themselves, the Ding an sich, as he puts it in German, the thing in itself, we can't know anything about that at all. So there are severe limits on our knowledge. And this goes quite extensively. Our perceptual faculties are such as to perceive things in space and time. So, space and time, he says, are a priori forms of sensibility. We hear things as if they're in space and time. We perceive things, we see things, we taste things in a sort of temporal order. And so, all of those things presuppose a structure of space and time. The realist will say, well, the world really is in space and time, that's why we do it. But he says, well, I don't know about that. I perceive things as being in space and time. Objects are in space and time as I perceive them, as my mind processes them. But what about the things in themselves? On the one hand, I can know that perceptual objects exist in space, that they exist in time. I can know that a priori. But that's because my mind processes things as spatial and temporal. Are the things in themselves really in space and time? He says, I have no idea. There is no way for us to know. We can only know things as processed by our cognitive faculties. We can't know what the thing in itself is. Well, what are these a priori concepts? Oh, yeah, question.
Would this be like something similar to like what it's like to be in a map where we can imagine what echolocation looks like, but we actually don't know the experience of what it actually is, or is that something more extreme?
Oh, all right, yeah, great question. Thomas Nagel wrote a famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Where a bat's perception is, for the most part, due to echolocation. The bat is, in fact, using sonar to navigate around the world. Well, what would it be like to be a being that didn't have our perceptual faculties, but instead navigated by sonar, and that was the perceptual faculty? There are certain kinds of fish that have a sense we do not have. They can sense magnetic fields. And so suppose our only sense organ, for example, were an ability to sense magnetic fields. What would that be like? And in particular, would that be something that really is spatial and temporal? Now, maybe it would be, but maybe not. And in any case, it would be radically different. Right? And so you might think it's not only really hard for us to imagine being a being that uses echolocation or that uses magnetic fields as a way of navigating around the world, but also you might think, gosh, here's an a priori truth for those fish. The world is magnetized. The world's just a magnetic place, right? Or for the bat, the world's a place where, gosh, well, these signals just bounce around. The world's a world of bouncing signals. And that's something that you might think is just true of the objects as perceived by a bat, or as perceived by these fish. But that doesn't mean the things in themselves are like that. And so you might think that's exactly the kind of thing that's going on here. Think back to Philo's argument from comparison, where Philo says, we don't know things as they are themselves, we know things as they relate to other things, and in particular as they relate to us. And Kant is basically saying, Philo had it right. I know the world as I represent it. The fish represents the world in a certain way and knows it as it's represented by that fish. The bat knows it in this very special way, based on its own perceptual faculty. And the objects that the bat takes as objects, the objects that I take as objects, they may be very different things. Who knows how a bat carves up its perceptual field into distinct objects? Yeah.
So would that be then an argument against a priori ideas, because you can't then ever know like an objective thing, I guess because we can't experience.
Okay, good. Philo takes this to a skeptical conclusion, right? So we can't know anything about the world as it is in itself. And Kant, as we'll see, agrees with that. In a way, this does lead him to a skeptical conclusion, which is, look, I can know objects as they're represented by me, so I can know about the appearances, and I can know about the mean a priori, but I can't know anything about the things themselves. And so you're right, in a sense, he just embraces Philo's conclusion. Yes, I can't possibly know. Is the world the way the bat perceives it, the way the fish perceives it, the way I perceive it? None of the above? For all I know, it's none of the above. But that doesn't mean I have to think, oh gosh, so I don't know there are people in this room. Of course I do, but I'm referring to people in the world as I construct it. Yeah.
So this is an extreme example, but what if someone had no like sensory organs, like they had nerve damage, they can't touch, they're not able to smell, see, hear, any of that. Are they capable of
Great question. He's saying, what about somebody who had no sensory inputs at all? Had no vision, no hearing, no echolocation, no magnetic sense, no smell, no taste, nothing. This is something like Avicenna's flying man, right? Where you imagine this person in sensory deprivation from birth. Is there anything they could know? The argument I've been giving you here is the argument in the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But he changes it dramatically in the second version of getting to these a priori concepts. And I think for just the reason you're worried about here. This all depends on my having certain forms of sensibility and certain forms of thinking. And then thinking back to, well, what makes that kind of experience possible? The experience of a flying man who has no sensory input at all would be presumably a really different experience. And so think back to Avicenna. Is there anything such a person could know? They don't see anything, hear anything like that. But could they know anything at all? I am. Exactly. They could know that they exist. The I think, the I am, presumably still holds for them. And so the second edition version of this argument depends crucially on the I think and doesn't really talk much about forms of thought connected to sensibility. Yeah.
Would they still be able to know that I am if they don't have a language that you have their own?
That's it. Yeah, okay, good. What do you mean they can think I am? How would they learn English if they had no sensory organs, right? So we can't mean literally I am. They wouldn't have a language to express anything in. Or would they? Could they have a language? Presumably it's going to be some private language, so if you're Wittgenstein, you will immediately say no, they couldn't have a language. But you might think, well, and I think Avicenna thinks, look, there would nevertheless be something going on in their mind. And they could have ways of conceptualizing whatever goes on in the mind, even though it's not going to look very much at all like what we do. And so there's something that is going to be able to happen in their minds that we would translate as I am. Even if, the translation would be very difficult. It'd be very hard to learn whatever's going on in that person's head. But imagine if, let's say, we were able to actually get them to communicate or somehow figure out what's happening inside their minds. I think the thought would be there's going to be something just based on what's happening in their mind. Yeah.
Wouldn't that indicate the self? Does that come from who experience and things like that? They don't experience it, so they still have the self.
Yeah, all right, good. This I am itself already assumes that there's something wrong with that no self view that Hume puts forward, that the Buddhists put forward. And so you're absolutely right. That presupposes that I actually have some connection. Yes?
So how does this subjectivism view of non-objective experience reconcile with the universal aspects that you just moral thought? If he frames things as conditional, but we all perceive things differently. How do we all arrive at the same moral question?
Okay, good, because he does think that there is a universality to these things. Now, maybe not universal across all species, if there are beings that perceive the world in radically different ways, but still he thinks that there are certain categories that are built into the mind. And so, for example, logical categories, like unity, plurality, and totality, he says. In other words, things that we would represent by, object or thing, substance, one, this, that, the. All of those are things that are, in a sense, built into the mind. Our mind carves things up into objects, just innately. Things like the distinction between singular and plural, knowing when it's one thing and when it's some things or several things. That's something built into the mind innately. Being able to talk about a totality of things, all those things, each of those things. Those are things that are built into the mind innately. Also quality, as he puts it, reality, negation, and limitation. But basically, yes, something being that way, yes. The difference between yes and no is innate, he thinks. True and false. Or limitation, something being unhappy or amoral or infinite is something that we can understand innately. We know what it is to negate things. He's really thinking here, there are certain operations the mind can perform independently of experience. Like it can identify an object. It can group objects together and talk about all of them. It can talk about things being true and false, or say yes and no. It knows what it is to limit things and apply negation. Then there are categories of relation. It knows what it is for something to be in an object. That relation of inherence we've talked about in the Ayavaisheshika. So we know what it is for something to be a thing, and then for what it is for it to have a quality, or stand in a relation, or to be in a sort of communal relation back and forth with something. And so all of the various words I've written down there are things that he thinks are really part of our innate structure. So that's true for any thinking being, he thinks. And so these things are going to be subjective, yes, in the sense that they're being supplied by our mind, but he thinks they're universal to the human mind. And so we don't have to worry that you're going to have your set of logical concepts and I'll have my logic, or that you'll have your morality and I'll have mine. These concepts are built into all of our minds just by virtue of our being human beings. And then finally, modality, possibility, necessity, contingency, existence. Those are things that he thinks are innate. So yes, even the flying man will be able to think about existence. Now, I'm going to come back to that I question for a moment, in a moment. But for the moment, all of these things, the difference between can and must, the difference between is and is not, and would, and so on, all of those things are innate to the mind. We bring all that to the table, as it were, before we even confront experience. Well, maybe there are things he's leaving out. I've tossed in things that contemporary logicians worry about, but I'll skip that now. The idea is this will lead us to certain synthetic a priori judgments, like the judgments of mathematics, or the idea from Aristotle that the world consists of objects that have properties and stand in relations to one another. That's something that is there by virtue of the structure of our thinking about the world. And so we can know that a priori. That every event has a cause, that we see these things as connected, causally as well as connected by virtue of identity. That everything relates in some way to everything else. All of those are things that are automatic. Well, then, yeah, there are a lot of them as he puts them. I'm going to skip that because they're hard to understand. But let me summarize it this way. The big picture here is this. We draw a distinction between phenomena. These are the objects as we perceive them, the objects of appearance, things as they stand in relation to us. The categories apply to them. The a priori laws of the understanding apply to them. And so we can know those with universality and necessity. The phenomena, Leibniz was right about. Okay, he said, yes, we can know things with universality and necessity because we've got these a priori concepts and a priori principles. And Kant says, you bet. And that's what enables us to know the objects of experience, to know some things about them a priori. But the noumena, those are the things in themselves. And here Hume was right. We can't know them at all. Those are the things as they're utterly unconditioned by our cognitive faculties. The categories don't apply to them. The a priori principles don't apply to them. And in the end, we can't know them at all. So I prepared a little chart that shows you sort of where he agrees with Descartes and where he agrees with Kant. Can we have synthetic a priori knowledge of something? Yes, we can. He says the rationalists are right about that. But can we have knowledge of things in themselves? Knowledge of the world beyond our experience of it? No, the empiricists